Good evening, I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
And I'm Melisa Idris.
And it's time to take a look at some of the most important stories of the day. And of course, the reform agenda has been on the news agenda for the last year or so. And to help us take this story further, we have a special guest in the studio today. We have Meredith Weiss. She's Professor and Chair of the Department of Political Science at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the State University of New York at Albany in the USA. And she, of course, as a long-time observer of Malaysian politics, has published many books, including this handsome volume about student activism. I think that's how we're going to begin the questioning, as it were. Melisa.
Brilliant. You know, Meredith, I kind of want to take a look back at the past month or so. I mean, July has been such an eventful month for reforms. The most, I guess, the one that comes to mind has been the amendment to lower the voting age for those to vote in the next upcoming elections to 18 years old. And I kind of want to dissect that. I mean, what did you make of that in terms of where Malaysia stands, or the Pakatan Harapan government stands, when it comes to its promises for reform?
I think it was a particularly interesting starting point for really substantial institutional constitutional reform, in part because this was new for Malaysia, the idea of a bipartisan support for a real institutional change, but also because it injects this level of uncertainty moving forward. So it's not a safe, secure change for either side. Both PAS and Pakatan benefited a lot from youth support. Both could benefit in GE15 from youth support. But in a broader sense also, that specific change recognizes a shift in Malaysia, which brings us in some ways back to the early years after independence, when there was a real thought that the youth should participate in politics, that university students should lead a political change, should be future leaders of the country. And that thought had really diminished over the years.
And this is a subject of your history. There's a very detailed history in this book, isn't it?
Very.
And it really ought to be a bestseller, I think, at this point in time. Melisa, Meredith, I mean, were you surprised by the bipartisanship? Because it wasn't necessary until the very last. I mean, I remember PAS coming in and saying, well, unless automatic voter registration is put into the bill, we're not going to support it. So, and there's always this funny thing, like, why would you want to give Pakatan Harapan a legislative win, even though you might think it benefit you?
That's really the reason why I was surprised by it, is that there had been, for instance, in the constitutional amendment discussion on East Malaysia, there had been some thought that, okay, even if the opposition supports this in principle and in discussion, they're not going to give Pakatan a legislative win. They're not going to vote for it because politics. And so I actually had expected that same outcome with the Undi change, the 18, yeah. So in that sense, it was just innately surprising. I think part of the reason that, and part of what makes this particularly surprising, again, part of the reason that the opposition as well as the government could support this bill is that either stands to benefit, and that all sides, all parties, have been so assiduously trying to court youth support, to raise youth civic consciousness, to run these different Sekolah Politik and these other different initiatives, really to get youth engaged and interested in issues. And so, on the one hand, globally, the 18 to mid-20s cohort tends to vote at lower rates. They tend to be very politically aware and active and so forth, but not necessarily to turn out to vote. And so that is generally the case in Malaysia as well, that younger voters tend to have a lower turnout rate than older voters. So it still could be a wash in that sense. But in as much as all sides see a chance to build up their base with this new catchment of younger voters, 18 to 21, I think there's a sense of something for anyone in this.
You said a bit earlier that this is significant because it introduces a sense of uncertainty. That's not been the case before?
There's always uncertainty in any election. Anyone can win. We've seen that in Malaysia. However, these are people who have no voting history. And we assume that young voters are idealistic and vote based on, but that can go in different directions in Malaysia. So an idealistic young voter who's not voting on taxes or concrete policies, but on their goals for society, which is what we tend to assume, rightly or wrongly, of young voters, in Malaysia, that might mean a vote for PAS as a vote for an Islamist polity, because that is a sincerely held ideological belief among a large share of younger, especially Malay voters. Or it could mean a vote for Kuttan as being a party with a history of social justice messaging, for instance. Or it could be a vote for BN if there's a sense of a past legacy for Malaysia as a developmental state, for instance. And so we have these different cultural trajectories that we might see the youth as promoting, but we don't know which one any one voter will necessarily support. Globally, we find that young people's vote often tracks that of their family that they've been socialized toward. But we also have a lot of geographic mobility within Malaysia. So youth who might be from Kelantan, for instance, but work and study in the Klang Valley. And so we don't really know what's building up their sense of political loyalty.
You know, one of the things, of course, is it's really a win for the principle of inclusion when it comes to participation in our democratic process. And, you know, just recently we had Global Bersih representatives on the show talking about that, because that seems to be the next stage. And of course for them as well, lowering the youth vote means Malaysian students studying overseas will get to participate. Now there's going to be a lot of trying to work out the precise mechanisms for that. But, you know, do you see on the horizon things like local elections, which is was part of the push, right, in the last 20 years?
Right. So this could be seen, and we have we can prognosticate, but we don't know yet how far this will go. But we can see this as an important first step toward expanding procedural democracy, expanding elections, the sense of entitlement to participate as citizens in an election, even if one is 18, that one can still vote. The automatic voter registration is just as salient, given Malaysia's problems in the past with voter rolls and voter registration and those sorts of issues of rolls that are gazetted too late for a certain number of people to vote and so forth. That presumably will go away now as a problem. The question of making it easier for voters overseas, Malaysian citizens who maintain their Malaysian citizenship, who plan to return to Malaysia, who have a vested interest still in Malaysia, to vote, whether they be students or others, that also is extremely important. Malaysia exports a huge share of its citizens, right? And often this is an issue of a brain drain. So often it's well-educated, economically self-sufficient, competent people who, if they can maintain a sense of a stake in Malaysia, might be more likely to return, might be more likely to feel a real connection to Malaysia, feel less disenfranchised. So there can be all sorts of important spin-off effects, even apart from the normative one of expanding participation in democracy, of making it easier rather than harder for people to exercise voice.
I just want to very quickly come back to something you mentioned before the interview. You said something that was really quite interesting. You said, you know, in the Undi 18 vote, Malaysia stands in stark contrast to what's happening in Singapore. Right?
Yeah, which has just reaffirmed not allowing the 18 to 21-year-olds to vote, even though the men serve national service, for instance. And so the Singapore government has reaffirmed, yes, youth may take part in other ways, through public forums, through expressing voice,